Thank you very much for the invitation. So my name is Maréchal. I work with the OECD. I'm one of the sector lead on the project looking at the implementation of our standard on responsible supply chain of minerals. We just had our annual forum taking place at the end of April, and it was all virtual, and we had quite a large participation with several hundred people connecting, which was really fantastic. So I'm really glad to be back again this year. I was invited last year, and happy to come back to focus a bit more on the various tools that our team has been developing over the years, and more specifically over the past 12 months, since we were all stuck because of COVID. We had a lot of time to actually go deep into some of the topics that we wanted to tackle for a number of months, and I'll be happy to share a bit more on these. I'll just take a couple of minutes to remind everyone of what the OECD guidance is and what is its purpose and objective. So it's basically, well, we could say a tool. It's a guidance for companies to help them understand how they can map their supply chain and conduct risk assessments throughout their supply chain to identify any potential connection with conflict financing, serious economic crimes, or abuses of human rights. Basically, this guidance requires those companies to undertake due diligence, and when they do identify a risk, to implement mitigation strategies. So the technical objective of this guidance is the one that I just described. But the overall objective is really to promote responsible investments in minerals resources production and trade in conflict affected and high risk areas. So this is really pretty much a tool whose objective is to enable companies to remain engaged in conflict zones or post-conflict zones, because we all know that in many of those areas, the extractive sector is pretty much the only one that's conducive to economic development if it's done the right way. So this really is a tool to help companies invest responsibly in the extractive sector in, again, what we call conflict affected and high risk areas. And that's what these are is a bit more complex. I can get into that later on, but that's pretty much the objective of our work. Oops. I don't know what just happened here. Some milestone. We started the negotiation of this guidance in 2009. It was adopted in 2011. And since then, it's been basically supported and promoted by many countries and industry associations, which have increasingly turned it into mandatory requirements. So initially, our standard is voluntary, but it's now part of the US law, the famous Dodd-Frank Act. Perhaps you know that section 1502 on supply chain transparency. It's now EU regulation that's come into force on January 1st. So it's now a mandatory requirements for importers of gold, tin, tantalum, and tungsten into the EU to implement our guidance. The LME, London Metal Exchange, has turned this standard into mandatory requirements for smelters and refiners. That will come into force, I think, in 2023. The LBMA for the gold sector has done the same, etc., etc. We're also talking with China and India and several other countries. The DRC has also integrated the provisions of the guidance into its own mining regulation. So it's really an increasing trend from all sides to turn those voluntary standards into mandatory requirements. Sorry again, just a snapshot of the global efforts of implementation. So basically, I'm not going to repeat too much of what I just said. It just provides you with a more user-friendly representation of that. But since we're working all along the supply chain from point of extraction to point of consumption, we have projects all around the world in producing areas and countries, in consuming countries, in trading hubs, and of course, in processing countries. So we've been making, for instance, lately some interesting progress in India on gold, in China on cobalt, I could go on for hours about this, but this is really truly a global implementation program with a significant uptake in all parts of the world. I won't spend too much time on this, but this is basically what I just said. Again, sorry for that, I don't know what's happening. I was just talking about the fact that our voluntary standard is increasingly turned into mandatory requirements. This is another demonstration of that. So that's not only focusing on the OECD guidance for responsible supply chain of minerals, but it covers all the standards that our Center for Responsible Business Conduct has been developing in the past 10 years. And what you can see is that increasingly our member states are using those voluntary guidance and standards to feed into their own regulatory process. And this is really, again, only increasing. Switzerland has recently announced that it would as well turn our guidance into a mandatory requirement. So it will be legal, a legal expectation under Swiss law, I think next year, to implement our guidance for all imports of gold. So that's really something that companies should be mindful of. Some key achievements up to date. So we've been implementing this for about, well, a bit less than 10 years now, but we can really see a significant uptake from countries and market makers and companies. Significant uptake and increasing participation from the private sector. Some of them forced, some of them being leader and understanding that it's probably in their own benefit. An increased understanding of what due diligence in supply chain means. Of course, due diligence is more of a financial term in the origin, but it's been increasingly applied to those issues of risk assessments and risk identification throughout supply chain. And I think companies are now increasingly aware of what that means and why this is being asked of them. And also something that we're very proud of, an increased global awareness of the need to engage with the artisanal mining sector. We do work a lot on ASM, of course, because this is the part of the supply chain that's the most vulnerable to conflict financing, racketeering, serious abuses of human rights. So a lot of our work is about how can we help global companies engage with responsible ASM and include them in their own mineral supply chains. Of course, we still have a lot of remaining challenges. In particular, sorry, this is getting out of hand. Don't know really why. So yeah, more meaningful and sorry about that. I'll try to get out of the presentation. That might make it easier. Yes. Works better. Some remaining challenges. Of course, due diligence is still a sort of a new concept, as I said, when it comes to undertaking due diligence in your supply chain. So what exactly does that mean? How can you do that, etc., etc.? That takes a lot of and promotional efforts. We have been doing that for a number of years, engaging with all sorts of companies, small and medium and large multinational, at all stages of the supply chain. So it is making progress, but it's still very challenging on some aspects. More financial support for the ASM sector in particular. This is extremely challenging for these companies to engage on the formalization and legalization path. So even though we have seen a switch in the mindset of large companies turning from a complete ban of ASM to a more open attitude towards ASM, that there is a lot of progress that still needs to be achieved. I mean, we still have many challenges, I have to say, but we still see a lot of demand for conflict-free minerals as opposed to demand for minerals that come with the right level of assurance, that risk assessments have been undertaken and mitigation strategies have been implemented. So again, a lot of education still needs to take place. It is very challenging for companies, obviously, because they have to manage a lot of expectations and their own legal constraints and requirements from their own clients on sometimes Africa-free supply chains or conflict-free supply chain. This is all. This takes a lot of time to go into the nuance and explain that our approach, as I said, is about engaging with the weakest part of the supply chain and not just boycotting and de-risking completely those supply chains. So that's keeping us busy at the moment.
Louis, can I ask you a question while you're still on the standards?
Yeah.
You showed us in a couple of slides ago, like different standards applied into different countries that incorporate what the OECD did.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you a question. So recently, the European Commission made these announcements about the EU going to develop their own proposal for due diligence on human rights and environmental impacts for companies based in Europe. How do you think this is going to change this whole standardization process, and what kind of more benefits that can bring into the table?
Well, luckily it's being done in sort of consultation with the OECD. Those discussions have been taking place for a number of years. We're working extremely closely with the European Union, as you can imagine. The draft regulation on conflict minerals was tabled in 2014, and that's about the time that we started cooperating a lot with the EU. So there's a lot of expectation on what the EU can do with this proposal. Hopefully there's already quite a lot of experience that's been accumulated on what is feasible and how you can actually achieve meaningful due diligence throughout supply chain. Now, of course, the current proposal would be taking this to a whole new level and a different, it's much bigger than what we've been talking about this far. Mm-hmm. It's extremely ambitious, but I think like companies are, as I said, now understand that this is a trend that they should not be fighting any longer. We've had a lot of resistance in the past. This is really, really decreasing. Honestly, I can tell you we've had like massive resistance and setbacks in the early days and even 3 or 4 years ago. But now with the support of many actually market participants, companies, even though they don't necessarily like it, understand have to live with it. And again, here, for instance, the London Metal Exchange Initiative was a game changer for us because this involves all the main metals markets and the biggest supply chains in the world when you're talking about minerals and metals. So to your question, I think this has a big potential to change significantly a lot of things. I always like to manage expectations. Things will not change overnight. This will take years and years and years. But it has to start somewhere, and it's really good that it's starting now. And I do believe that this will change a lot of attitude in the business.
Thank you.
The question. So coming now to some of the tools that we've been developing, and we're still busy developing. So this is pretty much our day-to-day job. So a lot of what we do is technical advice, either to companies or governments. Companies or industry association, etc., looking at how they can meaningfully operationalize, as we put it, our instruments. A lot of technical advice to governments and regional organizations, as I just said. We were extremely involved in the development of the EU regulation. The OECD Secretariat has actually a role by law in the EU regulation, which is a first for the OECD. So we tend to have bilateral conversations with different countries. For instance, at the moment, we're having a lot of conversations with India, with Colombia, with the DRC on cobalt. So that's a big chunk of our work. But I'd like to focus now on what we do in terms of research and tools development, because this is also at the heart of what we do. I have inputted here several hyperlinks that will be easier for you to click on and consult the documents that I'm going to talk about in a minute. But basically, one of our first mission, I would say, has been to commission what we call baseline assessments on producing areas. So we started in the DRC in 2015, went into Colombia in 2017, West Africa 2018, back to the DRC in 2019 on cobalt and copper. And forthcoming, there's a report on baseline assessment on gold supply chains in Venezuela. So basically what we do is a high-level risk assessment of those supply chains to flag any potential risk. When we talk about risk, we talk about those that we focus on, so conflict financing, serious abuses of human rights, and serious economic crimes. So those documents are widely available, and we hope that they help shed some light on the risk profile of these areas. Some of them we also commissioned with a specific objective as well. I have to say that the one on cobalt and copper in 2019 in the DRC was also to put back a little bit of the pressure on the large-scale mining companies in the context of the DRC. Sometimes some stakeholders have a tendency to use our work as a sort of a pretext to sort of ban ASM, pretending that all risks only exist in the ASM supply chain. Well, this report was actually intended to correct this misconception. And there's another project that was associated that I'm going to talk about in a minute. We really work on large-scale mining and artisanal and small-scale mining. You have different risks in those two parts of the supply chain, but they can be as important and as serious. And I think that's a message that we've been busy hammering in the past 2 years. I think the conversation is now balanced a bit, but a couple of years ago it was all about ASM, so we felt that we needed to correct a bit of that. We're currently doing some, by the way, just wanted to come back on a document that we just recently released, which is a frequently asked question on corruption in mineral supply chains. You can click on the links, you'll get access to it. It's basically a document that helps companies understand how they can conduct risk assessment of corruption deep down in their supply chain. So not just on their tier 1 supplier or tier 2 supplier, but the idea is to allow, for instance, a large automotive company to understand if it may be connected with corruption in any producing country. And you'll make the connection, I think, yourself with the previous report that I just mentioned. So this is a very good representation of the type of tool that we're trying to develop. Very user-friendly. It's a series of 12 questions, I think. We have done the same for responsible sourcing of ASM products. Questions that we've been asked consistently in the past. So we've taken all of these, put them together, brainstormed a bit, and tried to provide the private sector with some sort of easy answer on how they can conduct due diligence on corruption in mineral supply chains. Another big project that we've been able to advance in 2020, thanks to the pandemic, I would say, is research on the uptake impact and impact of our work. So we have released at the end of April a monitoring and evaluation framework of our own initiative. We've been also able to sort of identify the increase in the uptake of our work by companies, looking at a panel of 500 companies all around the world. This is all available on our website, and again, it's available on the links that I just shared. The work on impact will be published, I think, in June or July. So the first serious look at our own, at the impact of our own work, in particular on the conflict situation in the various countries that we're working in. So that's another very important project and something that's really expected by our donors, as well as by the private sector at large, because a fair question is, you're asking all of us to make those efforts, but how can you demonstrate that this is having any sort of impact? So that's exactly what we've been trying to do with this work. Another very interesting project that we were able to launch in April is what we call the Trends in Stakeholder Reporting. It's been a very complex and ambitious project. We've been reviewing around 40 different supply chains over 2 years, looking at publicly available sources with allegations of risks in those supply chains. So again, the report is available on our website. I just took those two nice graph that actually demonstrates and further emphasize the fact that risks are actually existing in all mineral supply chain. That shouldn't be a surprise at all, but it was to many of our stakeholders. You also have on the right an interesting graph that shows the risks that were mostly associated to those supply chains as per our research. So as I said, we covered 40 different supply chains, looking at 7 different languages. So we're not at all endorsing the allegations. This is just a tool to help companies start their due diligence. Just imagine that you're a company that's using 10 different minerals and metals, and you're trying to understand which one is potentially the riskiest for your company. This report will help you do that, and it will help you understand where you need to be looking for additional information. This report will also help you contextualize your due diligence efforts. So say if you're reading an article on any given risk in any given geography, this report will help you understand whether this is likely or whether this is completely impossible, etc., etc. So that's another tool that we've been developing to help companies implement our guidance. And I think I'll stop there. Just like to invite you to click on the second link here, the due diligence guidance. Let me see if I can do that now. No, I can't. This is basically a tool that we've also developed, a virtual version of the OECD guidance. And this is something that will help you go through the various steps of the OECD guidance in a much more user-friendly way than just going through the 140 pages of our documents. So I'll stop there. Thanks again for your attention, and I'll be really happy to take any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Louis. That was absolutely fantastic. So a round of applause from all of us in your audience.